Good evening, gang. I have a great topic I want to talk about. I've gotten a new microphone. There's a lot of stuff that's going to be changing. I'm going to be doing more of these. I am in the process of finishing up my. What am I saying? I have graduated college. Life's very cool. I'm in the process of also applying for a teaching certification for English and then hopefully gonna get my master's. So I really wanted to talk about something that's really interesting in my personal opinion, which is the rise of misandry, which is quote unquote. This is not me saying that there are problems that men don't have, but necessarily the fact that there are problems that we need to understand of social issues rather than prejudices. So let's get into it. On Twitter, there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of different things that I don't like seeing and I don't like reading, but there's a lot of stuff about how men have been oppressed, how men are now suffering through this male loneliness epidemic, they are suffering through misandry, how feminists now have always been doing this. To be quite frank, this has always been around. But it's now more prevalent since political issues and also since a lot of different worldly conflicts have been happening. But I really wanted to understand and really argue on the fact that misandry cannot be a real concept that is taken seriously while there is a large gap in the oppression of women versus men. And when I say this, I really want to make this very clear on the fact that there is also a line as to which of men can be discriminated against, but it's not off the basis of the fact that they are men. And this will always be my argument. This will always be true. You can say that men are being hurt and prejudiced by women, but this isn't necessarily a good enough claim. The reason why I say this is not necessarily because of, oh, men are hurtful, men are this, men are that. I can make that argument. To be frank, I have had very horrible experiences with men previously where it has affected my personal beliefs. But as someone who is a feminist theorist, as someone who is a philosopher, you really have to delineate yourself from your personal experiences and look at the real thing and look at what it is. And even when I look away from my personal beliefs and my personal issues, I still come to the claim that misandry cannot be real. Not because men aren't being hurt, men aren't suffering. That's not the problem. It's because it's not a real social oppression towards them. And that's not on the sake that men don't suffer. It's more on the sake that men will suffer through the intersectional problems that they have. But also, women will continuously suffer as long as we see these problems upheld and hurt. And I think it's a very weird world that we live in now. But I also think, and I hate to say this, but when you have femicides still happening in Latin America, in America, how could we possibly put those together when we have someone that is going on the internet telling people
it's your body, my choice. Will never, ever be a female president. Never. There will never be a female president, ever.
how could we possibly think that we are on the same level? Telling this to children, telling this to people that are very influential. I say this also on the basis of I think we need to reel back and understand critical theory and critical race theory and understand what exactly is the problem. Carrie Crenshaw mentions this notion and introduces the idea of intersectionality. I always kind of mention this when I understand feminism because I think this is a very true thing. When we have the understanding of cross cultural societies and cross cultural worlds, we also need to understand the problems within the fact that men also have an intersectional experience, even if we don't want to recognize that. As Black men, There is an experience there that is very unique rather than just this person. And this also relates to class. This also relates to race. This also relates to a lot of different things. But my point in this is the fact that when Sherry Crenshaw mentions that as we understand Black women in particular, they have a very different experience than Black men, and also as white women. And we need to understand that within this process and within this understanding of identity, this is where misogyny is shown. When we understand Black feminists, we also need to understand that when we look at our peers as Black men, as brown men, as Hispanic men, I hate to say this, they're not being hated solely off the fact that they are men, especially in their communities. If anything, they are more praised because they are men. But my point is that when you put them in a society that is so industrialized to think of, oh, you need to be this white man and you need to look like that in order for us to trust you, that is where that concept of misandry is being arisen. Because I think we have this understanding that men are being oppressed, but I don't think it's coming from the right place. Yes, there are men that are being oppressed. They are being oppressed for a real reason. It's not something that can be disclaimed as just this problem, but we need to also understand that within misandry, it's not so simple. It's not a real thing. I hate to say it. When we have women literally dying, being raped, when women can't get contraceptives very accessibly as they should, when people are quite literally being so dismissed as human beings, when we don't see each other as human beings, that's where the problem arises. And with the critical race theory aspect, we also need to understand the problem in which of this is my claim. Misandry is not real because misandry in reality is misogyny. Misandry is this kind of concept that men are being oppressed for having feelings, for having emotions, but I don't think people really understand that having feelings and emotions is a feminine attribute, is a womanly attribute. And this is something that Ellie Anderson mentions in her paper talking about hermeneutic labor. Hermeneutic labor is talking about the emotional weight of being in a relationship. The emotional women somehow have to hold this labor, do this labor more. And because of that, men can't hold that standard. This is why a lot of relationships end up not working, but it's also because we are socially raised in this way. And I think this really needs to come into claims of the fact that men are very disliked as human beings for having emotions, for having feelings. That is where a lot of these claims of misandry come from. That, oh, men are being sexually harassed and sexually assaulted and they're being attacked more and more and more. A lot of this has to do with the fact that when we have spaces for them, they are constantly dismissed. They are constantly dismayed, not only because of the problems that women face as they are also being sexually harassed. I will say they are being treated almost the same exact way when sexual harassment arises. Not necessarily the exact same way, but they are being hurt in similar ways. But I will also say that as women in this stance and as women in this world, there needs to be a distance. We can have this argument of, oh, look, women are being hurt just as much as men are being hurt. It's not necessarily the same thing, but it's also that men are now facing the problems that women have been facing. And not just that, but they are facing problems that are rooted within the patriarchy, that are rooted within our societies as we have understood men to be these manly men. I don't necessarily think that is an accurate point to make that misogyny is the same level as misandry. I also think that when we understand hermeneutic labor, we need to understand it as we think that women have this superior notion that we are somehow these emotional higher beings, that we somehow have this intuition that women are somehow some emotionally coddling superior human beings. That's not the case. It's the fact that we are socially raised to understand how our communities work. We should not be holding the emotional labor as if that is a solution, but rather that men also need to hold up the labor. And men also need to stand up in the sense of we need to dismantle the way that men are created in society. When you have created a system and you argue that the system is going against you, maybe that's the claim that is to be made. Maybe we should start reading more Marx. Not to be crazy, but I think this is the problem that comes up in these situations, that somehow men now are at the bottom of the barrel, but it has to do a lot with the racial dynamics. It has to do a lot with the problems of having these feminine attributes. And I did not realize I did not talk a lot about class in this, and I think that is a very huge part. I just need to take about 1 to 2 minutes about this. The military industrial complex is a huge problem that I see within people who are talking about the problem within misandry, how misandry hurts people. Men being drafted to war or being sent to jail is not a problem of misandry and a hatred of men. That is a problem of the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex. If you are not being used as a means of your labor for the system, then you are not valuable to people and you will be incarcerated. That is the reliance on that, and that is a part of also classism, because who is exempt of many cases of the draft? You can guess. Because of that, they're somehow not treated the same. I also think that we need to understand that men are our peers, whether or not we like it. Men will always be our peers. Men will always be our friends. If you don't agree with that, then I understand. And I also think this goes into the argument that Norman Frankel made once when talking to someone who said, like, "What do you feel about someone who hates me because I'm Jewish? What do I do now?" And he said, "My parents hated Germans for years after the Holocaust. That was all that they were exposed to. They didn't care what that person thought, what that person did. They hated them because they have suffered through such unimaginable oppression." And that's the reality. When women hate men, it's not because we hate them for the sake of existing, for the sake of being hurt, just for the sake of being themselves. We don't hate men because they're inferior. We hate men because we have been so dehumanized as human beings. We have been so hurt as complete objects to the world. I have been hurt by men for a large portion of my life. I have finally started to dismantle that, but I think this is the problem I have. I will say this too. When we also emphasize this notion of, oh, misandry is this great thing. Misandry, I make this joke that misandry, like, I am a misandrist, as sometimes as a joke. It's never serious. But I will say, people who do actually take that seriously of, oh, I'm a misandrist, I actually hate men, I really hate men. I think the truth is, you hate men so much to that point, I feel like that's a secret love for them. When you are very obsessed with them like that, it's secretly kind of an uplooking and upheaval and a sort of rise to their being. And I think that in itself should be dismantled, because I think we need to understand that we all hold genuine value. And I think when we don't have that within our own groups, it is very hurtful. And even then, I think if you know anything about feminists, you know that we don't actually believe, if you are a real feminist, we have allies, we have people in our groups. And I like, I feel as though I'm like, oh, I love men, oh, I love men. But in reality, you have to have allies in order Like, we cannot have a movement without having allies on our side. You cannot have a Palestinian movement without your Jewish peers. You cannot have a black movement without your white peers. You cannot have any of these uprising, any of these revolutionary movements without also working with the allies who don't necessarily understand the full thing but who sympathize with you. I think that's a very huge point that needs to be made. And I also think that when we understand misogyny and we understand misandry, we need to also understand the fact that when we have these rooms, when we have these spaces, misogyny will always be a problem because women are still dying due to the fact that they exist. Women are still being raped due to the fact that they exist, due to the fact that there are power structures and power dynamics that are in these spaces to affect others. And I think in reality of it all, we need to also rely on the fact that as we see men and women together, they will never be on the same level. Not because men are invaluable, not because men are never going to understand our oppression. It's the fact that women as people and as human beings have been socially raised to understand and to believe that we are inferior as humans. And this goes for brown women in particular too. To be dehumanized as people is such a problem within our society. This is why black feminism became a thing, because we saw people fighting for the rights of black people. We saw people trying to emancipate one another, but we didn't see that for black women. I think that's something that needs to be recognized. And I think that's also something that needs to be understood, that through our structures, through our problems, we are all human. We are all hurt. We all get our feelings hurt. But there's a difference between having your feelings hurt and then being genuinely threatened by society. Being genuinely threatened when you walk into a room filled with men and you are not represented and you are not uplifted. There is a reality of that. And there is something to be said about it. I hope this conversation was good. This came a lot from my own personal thoughts. This also came a lot from my own feelings of hopefully becoming a teacher and hopefully trying to understand these very complicated discussions that are going to come up. But at the end of the day, I'm very excited. I'm very excited for the world. I'm very excited for what's going to come. So, yeah.